Hi there, and welcome to the first in a series of videos which are going to help you look at the Western Front and medicine. And this is specifically tied to the historic environment part of the course that's part of the Edexcel programme. Now, I'm Mr. Armistice and I'm dressed here in an officer's outfit, complete with hat, which I usually wear for World War I Day, but I thought it was apt to get dressed up for these videos to help you understand a little bit more about what's going on with the Western Front. Behind me is a map, and that is dedicated to the Ypres salient, so I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a while. But first of all, I wanted to give you a little bit of a context. So the video one, this first one, is really designed to get you thinking about what the First World War was, reminding yourselves about what this war was, this 4-year war, and also giving you some of the major battles. Future videos will then look at the kind of medical problems that soldiers had to face, the nurses that were on the front line, the way that they got the soldiers from the trenches all the way back, and it will look at treatments as well. So all in all, these videos are helped to design, they're helped to kind of look at how you remember the Western Front medicine section. So to start with, I think first of all, let's begin with a map. So this here is a picture of the alliance systems. You've got Britain, France and Russia on one side, and then Germany, Austria, Hungary and Italy on the other. Now originally this alliance system had been set up with the idea of trying to prevent a war. It was trying to encircle these countries in the middle to make sure that they don't become aggressive. Areas of land down here in what was known as the Balkans, or the old Ottoman Empire, were falling apart. Austria wanted to go and get involved and get some land. Germany wanted to get involved. So did Russia. So the alliance system was designed to protect against war. The only problem was the build-up of weapons and arms and the lack of communication, and obviously the assassination of Franz Ferdinand helped expedite that war, helped bring that war about. So Austria and Germany helped by promising to protect each other. Italy took a sidestep out of the war, wouldn't join the war until 1915 and on the side of the Allies. And really over the course of 4 years, the war took place all over the world. For this course, we're specifically focusing on the Western Front. And so that's an area of land that's in France and Belgium around here. But equally, the war took place all over the place in Russia and Constantinople down here where Gallipoli is and so on. But that's our start point. The year that we want to start off with is the 4th of August, 1914. On the 4th of August, Britain declares war on Germany. And the simple reason is Germany had invaded Belgium to attack France. Once that happened, it triggered off a series of alliance jumps of all these countries jumping to support each other's allies. And we went to go and support poor old Belgium, and we sent our British Expeditionary Force of 100,000 men. They went to France, and they were then sent into Belgium to try and prevent the Germans from sweeping through. The next picture I've got here is an image which shows you France, Belgium, Brussels in a little bit more detail. So if I hold that there, in particular what you can notice is the distance from Britain to Calais. On here are marked lots of different battles. The key battles that we're going to talk about in today's video will be Ypres. There was a battle there several times. In 1914 and 1915 in particular. Then we jump down to the Somme, which is in France, and we'll have a look at what was going on down here, in particular where the River Ancre is there, the battle. And then we're going to have a look at moving back to further up the field at Arras. That was in 1917 in April. And then in July and October, we had fighting going on in 1917 at Passchendaele. And then the final battle we're going to focus on will be Cambrai, back down in France. So we've got 3 battles up in Belgium and 2 battles down in here that we're going to particularly look at today. All I'm going to do is explain really what they are, show you on the map how the First World War was fought, and give you a little bit of context to begin with. Okay. So to start with, this is a great little picture which shows the BEF, and I want to credit, there are lots of different sources that I got these from. The National Army Museum is a very good one. And they've got a whole wealth of paintings and images on there. So this one is an image which shows the British Expeditionary Force as they arrived in France. Now, if you think about this, in 1914, there hadn't been a war that the British had been involved with since the Boer War. So that ended in 1901, and that was against the South African Boers. They were farmers, and we went over to try and take parts of their land, get resources and so on. That war ended in 1901, and it proved that the British Army needed to change. So we changed by wearing khaki. Instead of the red uniforms that we'd seen before in the past, we changed and shifted to khaki. Officers were important, and the Navy was important, and the fledgling Air Force was around in 1914, but we didn't really get the Royal Air Force until 1918, set up in what we know as of today. So all of these different elements were at play, but like I said, the officers were designed to kind of direct this new war. Let's start off first of all with my first main battle. On the 4th of August 1914, after the BEF is sent over to France, first of all, they arrive at the River Marne, and it's really there that the British and the French join up. It's at the Battle of the Marne that they hold the line. The very first battle that the British actually take part in is something known as the Battle of Mons. Mons is in Belgium, and as the Germans swept through, the Belgian army used their fortifications, particularly near Liège, to try and hold the German army back. And as the Germans started to move through Belgium quite quickly, the British arrived at Mons with 100,000 men. And there's a small picture here that commemorates that scene. Now, the interesting thing about Mons, it's not part of the curriculum, it's not on the specification, but it's a fascinating story. Mons was the battle where the German army were held up. The British held the Germans at a canal. The bridge is still there, and there's a plaque that commemorates that battle. A number of soldiers lost their lives at Mons. In fact, in 1918, at the end of the war, the cemetery Nouveau Cheval, the cemetery that is in Mons, contains the first British casualty of the First World War and also one of the last casualties of the First World War, and they're opposite each other. Interesting little fact. But at the Battle of Mons, the British held back the Germans due to their very quick firing, which the Germans believed were machine guns, which held them back. When the British realised that the German army were in Mons and sweeping through, they gathered their forces and retreated. And they retreated to the Battle of the Marne. And it was at the Battle of the Marne that the British decided to hold their ground. And that battle took place between August and September. It's there that they decided to dig down into the ground to hold it through trenches. And at that point, once it got to September 1914, the British realised that there was only a small part of France that was, a small part of Belgium that was being held, and that was Ypres. If the Germans could occupy Ypres, they would be very, very close to the Channel ports, and they could cut off any supplies coming into France and Belgium, and pretty much effectively end the war for the British and the French. So the British were sent to Ypres, and it became known as the First Battle of Ypres, and that's the first battle that we're going to talk about. The First Battle of Ypres was horrific. There were something on the lines of around 90,000 British casualties. If you bear in mind the number of troops that had been sent over originally, that's quite a large number of casualties. Doesn't necessarily mean killed, it means wounded as well. There was a big recruitment drive then back home in Britain, and between 1914 and 1915, Lord Kitchener, the famous guy that said, our country needs you, he helped get soldiers to join up to take part in this battle. The most notorious thing about the Battle of Ypres is that the Germans rained fire down onto the town itself, and there are some wonderful pictures of Ypres that commemorate this, which show the town on fire. You can Google those and have a look. But the First Battle of Ypres was really where the British managed to hold on to this area. And I think at this point we're going to have a little bit of a closer look at Ypres using this map. Okay, right, so let's just explain a little bit about what we've got here. So Ypres itself is a town here, and it sits on a train line. This is the train line that we can see running down and across here. Poppering is a town behind the front line. Okay, the other side of Poppering, just a little bit further down here, would be France. So this really is the last holding point of Belgium. It's the only part of Belgium that was not really occupied by the Germans. The British needed to control this. Now, what you can see from this map here, lots of different lines, and they're explained up here in the key. You've got 1914, which is the First Battle of Ypres, 1915, which is the Second Battle of Ypres, which we'll talk about shortly, 1917, which is the Battle of Passchendaele, and then 1918, where the front line was by the closing phases of the war in Belgium. And then lots of areas, like wooded areas here, are marked out. But let's start by first of all talking about this. Here you've got what's known as the Ypres Canal. This canal was taken over in 1914, and on one side, you'll notice here, you've got the British with the other side of the canal in 1914. So this red line shows that the British were guarding Ypres, and so they were here by 1914, the First Battle of Ypres. The Germans occupied all of this land here. This is all high ground, so where Langemarck is, Zonnebeck, Hoog, Hill 60, all of this is, so this darker shaded colouring on the map is high ground. And that high ground allowed the Germans to have a good position down, and it was very difficult to climb up. I mean, we say that it's quite high, but it wasn't particularly high in terms of mountains and hills. But because Belgium was quite flat, it meant that any high ground would allow you some clear visibility, and that went to the Germans. The British, when they were here in 1914, managed to hold the town at great cost, and it would be at great cost that the British and the Belgians and the French would pour men into this area to try and hold it. Which then brings us to now the Second Battle of Ypres. The Second Battle of Ypres was characterised by the very first use of chlorine gas. The British had been experimenting with gas, but it was the Germans who used it first. The first use of gas came in this area here. It was originally planned for down by Hill 60. In fact, there were some containers that were hidden there. If you notice though, the red line, the British red line, runs around Hill 60. So the British had occupied the area quite quickly by the start of 1915 and had discovered these odd little canisters and didn't quite know what they were to begin with until they investigated them. The Germans had originally planned to go from there, but instead what they did, a bit further up by Saint-Julien up here, this is where they released gas for the very first time on a wide front. And so we can see where the brown mark is here. This is what the British were occupying in 1914. So they had all of this area here. The red mark is the Second Battle of Ypres. And what happened is the Germans managed to actually move a lot closer to Ypres. So we can see that the occupation of Hill 60, which is an area of high ground, was contested by both the Germans and the British. And honestly, they were a train track away from each other. That's how close they were in that respect. There's a memorial at St. Julian, which is of the brooding soldier, which is one of the Canadian memorials, because it was Canadian troops that faced off against the gas there. At a place called Sanctuary Wood down here, gas was also released, and British, Canadian, Indian troops had to use very quickly made handkerchiefs soaked in urine to try and protect themselves against the gas. So that was a way of trying to combat the gas. But that's one of the features of the Second Battle of Ypres. Let's pull ourselves back out a second. Go to a bit of a wider shot. So you've got the bigger map there, and it shows you what was going on. This is an image which shows you those makeshift masks, and they really did just quickly, use their intelligence. The Canadians didn't move, and that's one of the reasons why the monument is at St. Julian, just up here. It marks the point that the Germans could have successfully taken Ypres. One of the problems with the gas, though, very unpredictable, and it blew back against the attackers as well. So the Germans failed to capitalise on any of the gains that they made. So they could have swept through here, but instead they just got a lot closer to Ypres. And this bit, the Ypres Canal that I mentioned earlier, was flooded. So they allowed the river to flood in the area, and the canal itself was used as a barrier from finally taking Ypres itself. But that's a picture there which hopefully makes you remember what the Second Battle of Ypres was all about. Don't forget, the Germans are trying to take hold of Ypres because they want to get access to the Channel ports and stop the British getting reinforcements in. Okay, another feature that you need to be aware of is that Ypres is a salient. Now, the best way to describe a salient is almost like a fist, because it's pushed into the enemy territory. And a salient is a kind of horseshoe-shaped area where three sides can be attacked by the enemy, but you've got one point of entry. So if you notice, look at the brown line here, it's a giant fist into the enemy lines, and that's the only point of entry they've got into Ypres from the west. Obviously, by 1915 that's shrunk, but it is still a salient. So that's what we mean by the Ypres salient. It's a small area surrounded on three sides by the Germans. Okay, that's 1915 over. At that point, by the end of 1914, and certainly by the beginning of 1915, the Allies and the Germans had realised they weren't going to win this war very quickly, and so they dug in. Now, the Germans dug their trench system so that they had control of the land. They hoped that any future peace that would come up would mean that they could negotiate on a much stronger position. As long as they couldn't be forced out of the land, they had it, and potentially could even keep it after the war was over. So, for the British and the French, it was a very different perspective. They believed in something known as the big push. So they didn't want their troops digging in because they were afraid that morale would drop. So what they did is they dug their trenches, made them from mud and wood and so on, the classic images of the trench, because they didn't want their troops staying in them for too long, because they wanted to push the enemy out of France and Belgium. The Germans had built theirs out of concrete, and when the British arrived in those trenches, they realised why it was so difficult to get them out. Okay, so 1915, we then have a sideshow. So if I go back to the original map, and I talk about 1915, one other event that took place in 1915 was down here. It was known as the Dardanelles, this little bit of area here. It's where the British and Indians and Australians and New Zealanders attempted to take control of Constantinople. If they could get here, they could knock Turkey out of the war, because the Turks were on the side of the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. So if they could come through here, they could and land, they could knock them out. Gallipoli proved to be quite a difficult plan. There's various reasons that I'm not going to go into in great detail in this video, because I just want to give you an overview of all of the battles of the war that are important. But Gallipoli failed for mainly the fact that there was a lack of speed. Once the men had actually arrived on the beaches, they didn't really have the right equipment to push on. They lost the element of surprise by using ships, and the Germans were also advised by the Turks were also advised by the Germans who were there as well. One of my relatives was at Gallipoli, and he was there for a few weeks, possibly even months, and then he contracted a disease called enteric fever and was shipped back to Malta, where he died in hospital. The disease and infection was a big problem in places like Gallipoli because of the flies. And that same issue could be applied to the trench system. Once death happened and bodies couldn't be buried, lots of flies would land and feast on them and then fly off and land in food and onto people and so on elsewhere. But we'll talk specifically in another video about the conditions. Let's get back to our events. It gets to 1916, and recruitment has been a much higher priority for the British. They want to become quite a large land power. Bearing in mind that we're a naval force, the British really didn't have soldiers in the same numbers that the French and the Germans did. By 1916, they had forced conscription, which meant that anyone between the ages of 18 to 40 had to join the war. Now, these people joined as the people that had joined as volunteers were given quite a lot of training. By 1916, the training program had shortened, and in some places, you would get 2 weeks worth of training before being sent out to the trench system to learn on the job. The very first real job that the British were planning for was a battle in France, which was known as the Battle of the Somme. Now, the Battle of the Somme was a particularly tricky battle. It was the first one we were going to do primarily on our own. The reason why is because at Verdun, which is a little further south in France, the Germans were throwing man after man after man, soldier after soldier after soldier at the French. The French were not going to let go of Verdun. It was historically important. It was also the gateway to sneak around and attack Paris from the south. So the French needed to hold on, therefore couldn't commit troops to a battle on the Somme riverbed. And I kind of want to give you a basic understanding of the Battle of the Somme, and then show you another map that I've got, which shows you the battlefield site of the Somme. Let's first of all have a look at another image. This image here shows you soldiers in a sunken road preparing for the assault. Notice the difference here between the soldiers that we saw in 1916 and those in 1914. So this time they've got steel helmets. These were known as the Brodie helmet. These had been designed obviously for impact from shrapnel. That's from shells as they explode, they ricochet off the head. Cloth hats were no good. If you got hit by pieces of shrapnel or even bullets, that it would go straight through the cloth hat. Officers themselves still wore the cloth hats like these, and certainly these hats were used from 14 to early 1916 for the British and the Australians and Indians. But by 1916, the Brodie helmet was being used. Helmets were also being used by the Germans and the French, and you could see here the development in technology. So that's one difference that we've got. By 1916, we've got a whole new group of people, like I said, who had joined up, and these people they joined in pals battalions, friends battalions, groups. So part of the training was to encourage you to join up with folks in your town or your area. And obviously we were aware that lots of people died in the Battle of the Somme. Numbers go to 20,000 dead in just one day. It was the worst death total for the British Army since records began and ever since. And there were a huge number of people who were wounded and who were missing as well. 57,000 are on the Thiepval Memorial in France, and they're dedicated to the men that lost their lives in that battle. It didn't go particularly well. It was disastrously wrong. The Battle of the Somme was to take pressure away from Verdun, and it started on the 1st of July 1916. The British were using standard tactics though. So what happened was they would use artillery, big cannons firing shells from behind, and they did that for a week. Once the bombardment finished, they were hoping that the barbed wire in the German positions would have been destroyed, and the men were ordered to carry packs on their back to repair the trenches in the German side and hold the land. They'd carry their rifle. When the whistle blew at 6:30 in the morning, they would climb out of the trenches and head over no man's land towards the German positions. The only problem was Germans were they were on the high ground. They had a week's warning that this was going to be happening. Once the bombardment had finished, the Germans got themselves into position. A series of mines ripped across the front line, blowing up. These are underground explosives that they buried underneath the trenches, and they blew up, ripping across the German positions. Even with that, the British were walking across no man's land, arguably to try and keep in line and to try and keep the order. They'd never had such a mass movement of men, inexperienced men arguably as well. And arguably, I suppose, if they didn't have their packs and had run, they probably would have been successful. There was one group in particular who were the most successful. They were an Irish group, the Ulsters, who attacked near Thiepval Wood. And as they came out of the wood, they'd already, whilst the bombardment was happening on the morning of the attack, crawled across no man's land. So they were more or less halfway. When the whistle blew and the mines exploded, they were there in the German positions, heading to a position known as the Schwaben Redoubt. Unfortunately, the Ulsters were pushed back, and a few of them managed to survive, but they had high casualties. Just to bear in mind that the Victoria Cross, one of the highest awards in British military history, in the 2003 Iraq War, Johnson Bahari was awarded 1 Victoria Cross. During that particular engagement, 9 Victoria Crosses were awarded just to the Ulster Regiment for their actions on that morning. So high value, high cost, and it certainly didn't push through to the end of the war. Let's now go back to the story of the First World War. Let's go to Arras. So Arras is in northern France. It's north of the Somme, and we're now 1 year on, 1917. Let's go to this map and show you our location. So here is the Battle of the Somme. Here is where Arras is. It's further north. Arras is in a place where there are lots of coal fields and resources, big train lines and so on. The Germans had the high ground surrounding Arras, and below, fortunately for the Allies, for the British and the French, they'd found a series of tunnels. Old quarry. It was an old quarry. The town had been built on a quarry. A wonderfully interesting place called Wellington Quarry is underneath Arras. And what happened was the New Zealanders and Australians, who were experienced miners, and Welsh miners from Britain and northern miners from Britain, had been brought to Arras to prepare for this battle. They'd spent a year living underground, massing up their troops and their equipment and their men. And what they did, this is the exit point. Wonderful picture, this. It's the exit point of the tunnels at Arras. And you can see it says number 10, exit, and then you've got the stairs, and to the right, that would be where they left. The battle took place in April 1917, and it was again designed to be the big push. What happened was big explosions big mines ripped underneath the German positions. This is an exit point here, and the Canadians, Australians came out from Arras and attacked a place known as Vimy Ridge, which is where there's the largest Canadian memorial to the First World War. The Battle of Arras had some success, but it still wasn't the breakthrough that they needed to try and end the war. So we're into 1917, and the battle took place in April and May 1917 to some degree of success. Then, as part of the Arras battle, they then decided to shift their attention back here to Ypres, and this was going to be known as the Battle of Passchendaele, which is the next key battle. So we've done first Ypres, second Ypres, the Battle of the Somme. Now we're on to Passchendaele. This was October to November 1917. I'm going to zoom in on the map again. Angle us up a little bit. And you can see Passchendaele, just there. Right, okay, so October 1917, we'd learned from the mistakes of the Somme. This time what we were going to do, we were going to launch our artillery at the Germans, and at the same time walk our men out. It was known as the creeping barrage, so that the shells would drop down, and as the shells were dropping, the Germans were taking cover. We would be walking behind this curtain of shells to then arrive on top of the trenches and take them. The biggest problem that we were going to face, though, was the terrain. At Passchendaele in particular, it was incredibly muddy. In fact, it kind of clay mud, and as you kind of stepped into the mud, you would sink into it. And then you'd have to pull your own leg out and then move on and so on. It therefore meant transport was difficult. Getting the artillery up, therefore, was very difficult. So once they captured a certain position, the artillery struggled to move in the mud because of the terrain, and as a result, it ended up becoming very much like the Somme, a very difficult battle where soldiers were throwing themselves uphill to try and take various different places. So this is the end game. This is Passchendaele. The British were starting from their positions in 1915 here. So they were having to travel up this road to Passchendaele. Zonnebeck is another position that was held by the Germans, and this also was part of their attack. By the end of the battle in November 1917, they'd achieved their objectives. The Canadians and New Zealanders had taken Passchendaele, but at a massive cost, and it didn't last long. The Germans were able to recapture Passchendaele a few weeks after we'd taken it. And there's a fantastic image that you can Google. If you Google Passchendaele World War I aerial bombardment, you could see what Passchendaele looked like before. Very small village, and then afterwards it looked like the surface of the moon. And soldiers described seeing the site as something they like another planet. So we're marching during the Battle of Passchendaele from Ypres up here to this area of high ground, and it was eventually taken, but my God, at a great cost. And for anyone that's gone on battlefield trips and you've seen the location, you'll see what was so difficult. There was a direct line of sight from Passchendaele into Ypres town centre. So bear in mind, if you're marching up that way, it's going to be very difficult to avoid machine gun fire. And the way that the Germans had positioned their machine guns, it was known as enfilade fire, where machine guns were angled so that at some point you would not escape the bullets. There would be like a wall of bullets you'd have to march through. So it made it very difficult. Bear in mind what the Battle of Somme was like, just going back to the Battle of the Somme. The Somme included quite a lot of fighting on chalk land. So the issue with Passchendaele was the mud, and here is an image which illustrates that best. I absolutely love this image because it's quite simple and straightforward, but encapsulates the biggest problems with this battle. This shows you the type of clay mud. Look at the surroundings. There's hardly anything around. There's no buildings. There's no nothing. Fields. And this would have been a field, all gone. Notice the very deep, muddy holes which people could have fallen into. Notice also the men. This chappie here is a medic because they've got the armbands on. This man is being carried on a stretcher. Look how many men there are. 1, 2, 3, 4 to carry the stretcher. 5, 6, 7, 3 in reserve. If these guys got caught in the mud, it would need 7 men potentially to take out one individual. There are some really interesting accounts of how men really struggled with these scenarios and trying to transport the wounded back to casualty clearing stations and regimental aid posts and so on. But the mud was different in the Somme. You can't really notice it in the picture, but it's solid. It was clay. It was a much more difficult terrain. Therefore, it meant that the holes that you created would fill up with water very quickly. It didn't mean that you got stuck in the mud. It just meant that the water table was quite high. So you'd find that water would be sitting in your trenches. And if you went to the Somme and you saw some of these trenches today, you could see where they put trench pumps to try and get the water out. So that was Passchendaele, and that was 1917. There were some successes in places like Messines. Another one of my relatives, I think he's one of my relatives, is an Australian soldier, died during the Battle of Messines. Messines is down here at the bottom of Ypres, near Hill 60, and in fact it's just down here. I've stayed here before with school trips. Messines again is high ground, but here we had much better successes. It was an earlier phase of the Battle of Passchendaele where they realised it was actually going to work. Creeping barrage, underground mines, they ripped through Messines, and the Indians, Sikhs, British, Canadians, New Zealanders, and there's a New Zealander memorial there, swept into Messines very quickly with less casualties. And equally, it was a successful use of cavalry, something that we hadn't seen being used effectively really in the war due to artillery machine guns. Anyway, now let's go on to the final phase, which is the end of the war. In 1917, October, November, the Russians are knocked out of the war by a revolution. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party take Russia out of the war, and that allows the Germans to move their troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. Big alarm bells now, because Britain and France really need to step up their game to stop the Germans from winning at this point. That successfully happens, though, when the Americans join in April 1917. So a few months earlier, the Americans had agreed to join. The reason why is because they believed the Germans were attempting to supply the Mexicans with weapons to fight a revolution against America. So America joins the war, effectively arrives in December 1917, and then starts putting troops into battle by January 1918, the last year of the war. So let's go to our final battle. So we've done first Battle of Ypres, second Battle of Ypres with the gas, Battle of the Somme, which was the worst day for the British Army. We've done the Battle of Passchendaele. Now we're going to move on to the Battle of Cambrai. And Cambrai is located in France, so we're going back to France this time. The Western Front was involved a lot of fighting along here. Let's go back to our map. And we can see there was the Battle of Arras. There's Passchendaele, and we're here at Cambrai. Cambrai is famous for the use of tanks. The tanks have been used since November 1916 to end the Battle of the Somme. So the Battle of the Somme didn't start with tanks, but it certainly ended the battle with tanks. Tanks were useful, but they were slow, a little bit unreliable. The fumes inside were incredibly poisonous, so every now and then you'd have to stop. If they broke down, you were a sitting duck. And we abandoned a lot of them in the first use of them, and the Germans got hold of them, cannibalised them, and were able to make their own as a result, which leads us to the Battle of Cambrai. This is a battle that involved the British trying to push the Germans out of France, and it involved a huge tank battle. That's the biggest thing to remember with Cambrai. It lasted just a month, November to December. Huge number of British and huge number of German tanks. Effectively a British victory because we were able to use that to start pushing the Germans back. And it also meant that the Germans realised that they had got one line of defence left, which was to retreat back to a defending position. It wasn't just the Battle of Cambrai that decided that, but the Germans believed that if they were going to ride this war out, they would pull back to a much heavily defended line known as the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line was a lot further back into the borders of Belgium and France. Incredibly well-built series of trenches out of concrete, very far back, high commanding positions, over rivers, canals, that type of thing. Very, very difficult. And the Allies didn't really know what they were going to do. It was the Battle of Amiens that would eventually break that, and that was in August 1918. But the Germans gave it one final roll of the dice. In spring 1918, the Germans decided to throw everything they'd got at one last effort to stop the British, the Americans, and the French from winning the war. So in spring, they threw everything they had and caught the Allies completely by surprise. A lot of what had been gained in the Passchendaele offensive was lost, as I mentioned earlier. You'll notice the black line, which is where the Germans got to. It's the closest they got to taking Ypres. They pushed from right back here, which is where in 1917 Passchendaele had achieved its victory. They pushed all the way off the high ground into the low ground, past St. Julien, where the Second Battle of Ypres gas was released, back to the 1915 line, and then finished just here, really super close to Ypres. The same happened with France. They got very, very close to taking Paris. In fact, meters. They were, several miles they were from taking Paris. The parishioners had sent a lot of their people out just in case Paris was bombed and attacked. But they exhausted themselves, and the British and French and Americans were able to stop the line, stop the attack, and then came their offensive. And it would be August with the Battle of Amiens, where the British, the Americans, and the French, using air force, artillery, soldiers, tanks, combined for the first time, and they pushed the Germans beyond the Hindenburg line, pretty much back to where the war started in Mons. This is a picture here of one of the British tanks. You notice here with the tank that you've got a series of sandbags just underneath. It's a great quality picture. You've got what appears to be an engineer inside. He's not wearing his uniform properly, so which makes me think that he was inside the tank. You've then got a number of individuals here just underneath it. It looks like it's stuck, but you can see the caterpillar tracks here. You've got the gun turrets on the side. The Tank Museum in Dorset is fantastic to see examples of these tanks when they were used. This is an example of what happened at the Battle of Cambrai, though. And then this photograph shows Compiègne, which was the forest where the French and the Germans signed the Armistice at the end of the war. And that is the end of my photographs. And also, interestingly, the end of the story. So this first video was supposed to be a snapshot of the First World War, giving you an idea of where it started in 1914 to where it ends in 1918. Remember, the Germans didn't end up losing the war in terms of invasion. There was an armistice. Everyone decided on the 11th of November 1918 to put their weapons down. The Allies had won. It would be June 1919 that the Germans would know the cost of that war, which was signed in the Treaty of Versailles, and eventually it would lead 20 years down the line to the Second World War because of Germany's hatred towards the conditions the Allies had given them. In terms of our exam, in terms of coming back to this idea of what we've got to know, you need to know those key battles that I've mentioned. So Cambrai, which was November to December 1917. You've got Passchendaele. You've got the Somme, 1916. Second Battle of Ypres, and the First Battle of Ypres. They're the five that they mentioned, the five that you should really know about. I hope this video has been useful, and future videos will look at trenches and conditions and so on. Thank you very much.